we are entrusting the day and the endeavor to the Lord. Let's go. Welcome to my channel where I visit many good books, but live in the Bible. My name is Sarah Christine, and today I want to talk about none other than H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds. I picked this up because three people that I really respect mentioned this in the course of a week, independent of one another. And they were a pastor at my church, Man Langle in her amazing Veritas Forum lecture, and my dad. And the last two in particular got my attention because if I were to make a Venn diagram of what my dad and Man Langle have in common, it would look like that. There would be one point of contact, very much in the vein of Etheridge Knight's poem, A Wasp Woman Visits a Black Junkie in Prison, where at one point he writes, after the seating and the greeting, they fished for a denominator, common or uncommon, and could summon only the fact that both were human. Yeah, that would be Man Langle and my dad. The point of contact is that they are human. So the fact that they were both bringing up this story piqued my interest. A brief summary of The War of the Worlds. It is about Martians landing in the south of England. It was published in 1898 by H.G. Wells, the father of sci-fi, and was one of the earliest examples of quote-unquote arrival lit, though at the time it was classified as scientific romance, which I don't really get because there's not a lot of romance in this. Anywho, the interesting thing about this book and the point of history that Pastor Man Langle and my dad all brought up was that in 1938, a radio broadcast was made wherein this story was moved from being set in South England to being set in New Jersey. And a couple of the people that heard the broadcast thought it was really happening, that Martians were invading New Jersey. And it caused a panic because the aliens in this book were not coming to be friends. They were not like Vulcans. There was no offer to live long and prosper from them. And hearing that, you may think that this book is like a high octane adventure narrative, and that would be incorrect. It is written very much like a report. It can be pretty dry in places, and there's a lot of the narrator hiding or musing about the philosophical ramifications of the fact that human beings have been displaced from the top of the food chain. I like that, but you may not. So just heads up. And I'll give you a taste by reading the first paragraph of the story, which I think sets the tone. No one would have believed in the last years of the 19th century that this world was being watched keenly and closely by intelligences greater than man's and yet as mortal as his own. That as men busied themselves about their various concerns, they were scrutinized and studied, perhaps almost as narrowly as a man with a microscope might scrutinize the transient creatures that swarm and multiply in a drop of water. With infinite complacency, men went to and fro over this globe about their little affairs, serene in their assurance of their empire over matter. It is possible that the infusoria under the microscopes do the same. No one gave a thought to the older worlds of space as sources of human danger, or thought of them only to dismiss the idea of life upon them as possible or improbable. It is curious to recall some of the mental habits of those departed days. At most, terrestrial man fancied there might be other men upon Mars, perhaps inferior to themselves, and ready to welcome a missionary enterprise. Yet across the gulf of space, minds that are to our minds as ours are to those of the beasts that perish, intellects vast and cool and unsympathetic, regarded this earth with envious eyes, and slowly, surely drew their plans against us. And early in the 20th century came the Great Disillusionment. The Great Disillusionment is that we are not the baddest cats in the sky. Thought we were, but surprise, surprise, there is a bigger, badder cat in the sky. Deal with it. And honestly, the tone of resignation in the novel, from the narrator principally, but also from the other characters to the Martian invasion, initially took me by surprise. But then I sat back, had to think about the historical context of this novel and the fact that Wells was writing at the turn of the 19th century. And so a preeminent intellectual influence of that time was Darwin's theory of evolution and natural selection. And when I thought about that, I was like, okay, this makes a little bit more sense, because crudely and colloquially, Darwin's theory of evolution and natural selection comes down to survival is determined by fitness. It is survival of the fittest survive. And if that is the assumption of Wells and his narrator in this book, the resignation to the Martians' conquest of Earth doesn't really come as a surprise, because if you believe the undergirding law of nature is that the fittest survive, when a fitter, stronger, superior being drops out of the sky and starts turning your neighbors into fish fry, you can't say that's bad. You can only say that's life. I am not so inclined to believe that Darwin was correct about the basic facts of life, so I can say that's bad and make all manner of other normative judgments, which is what I'm going to do with the rest of this review. But fret not, I will not, surprisingly, be spoiling this book. I will just be sharing 3 takeaways I had about what to do and not do in the event of an alien invasion or a similarly high-stakes, high-stress occasion. Takeaway number 1, or the first thing that you should do in the event of an alien invasion, is to beware of seams. Early on in the War of the Worlds, before the aliens arrive, the narrator writes, page 15, "One night, the first missile then could scarcely have been 10 million miles away. I went for a walk with my wife. It was starlight, and I explained the signs of the zodiac to her and pointed out Mars, a bright dot of light creeping zenithward, towards which so many telescopes were pointed. It was a warm night. Coming home, a party of excursionists from Chertsey or Isleworth passed us singing and playing music. There were lights in the upper windows of the houses as the people went to bed. From the railway station in the distance came the sound of shunting trains, ringing and rumbling, softened almost into melody by the distance. My wife pointed out to me the brightness of the red, green, and yellow signal lights hanging in a framework against the sky. It seemed so safe and tranquil." Seemed is the operative word there, because in short order, the first Martian spacecraft arrives and things go from seeming so safe and tranquil to being not. And the narrator sees a couple of his friends who had approached the pit with a white flag of truce and welcome get barbecued. And in the aftermath of that, the military begins to assemble around that first pit, setting up defenses, and the narrator thinks to himself on page 48, "I must confess, the sight of all this armament, all this preparation greatly excited me. My imagination became belligerent and defeated the invaders in a dozen striking ways. Something of my schoolboy dreams of battle and heroism came back. It hardly seemed a fair fight to me at the time. They seemed very helpless in that pit of theirs." It hardly seemed like a fair fight to me at the time. They seemed very helpless in that pit of theirs. Friends, if the War of the World teaches you anything, it is do not rely on how things seem, because we go from seems like they're helpless, seems like it's not a fair fight, to quickly being like, well, based on what it seems like, you know what seems right? Is that we wouldn't take the first shot. We'll just let them hang out in their pit, and I'm sure whatever happens, we'll be more than equipped to deal with it. They are not, which is no surprise, because again, they're relying on seams. When the Bible says in Proverbs 14:12, there is a way that seems right to man, but in the end leads to death. So my first takeaway from the War of the Worlds is don't rely on seems like, and be very cautious of acting on what seems right, because you might get fried. My second takeaway from the War of the Worlds is that even amidst an alien invasion, do not neglect the war against the flesh. Yes, this book is called The War of the Worlds, but as a Christian, that is only 1/3 of the unholy trinity. We have 3 enemies: the world, the flesh, and the devil. It is a war on 3 fronts, and the War of the Worlds illustrates how dangerous it is to neglect the second one. I want to clarify, when Christians typically talk about going to war against the flesh, we are typically talking about lust and, sex. And as I said before, the War of the Worlds is pretty thin on the ground when it comes to romance, unless you wanted to say that the Martians are a product of a torrid affair between Ursula and a walk, which maybe. But there are other attributes to our fallen flesh, and in the War of the Worlds, the 2 I want to talk about are cowardice and slothfulness. The first is embodied in a character our narrator comes across when he's on the run from the Martians, who's just called the Curate. And on page 155, our narrator describes him like this. He was one of those weak creatures, void of pride, timorous, anemic, hateful souls, full of shifty cunning, who face neither God nor man, who face not even themselves. That may not seem like the most charitable description, but it is not inaccurate, because the curate spends most of his time hysterical, eating all the food, or like whining to himself and saying how hopeless everything is. And at one point, the narrator gets so frustrated with him, he just grabs him and he says, "Be a man," said I. "You are scared out of your wits. What good is religion if it collapses under calamity?" He basically Edna modes him. My God, pull yourself together! Like, pull yourself together! Snap out of it, which is entirely appropriate from my perspective, because if the curate is a real believer, he should not be acting like this. He should not have collapsed under calamity, because we are told in Romans 12:12, we are to rejoice in hope, be steadfast in trial, and be constant in prayer. We are not supposed to be running scared. 2 Timothy 1:7 says, God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of self-control. The curate is not demonstrating power and love and self-control. He is giving fear, which in my opinion is a function of the flesh, because we are told in Romans 8:6 that the mindset of the flesh is death, but the mindset of the spirit is life and peace. Life and peace will stand up to calamity, but not so the flesh, because the flesh is preoccupied with a fear of death. That said, the fear of death and the cowardice that is on display in the curate isn't the only thing wrong with our flesh. There are a lot of things, but the other major one that is on display in the War of the Worlds is a lack of discipline, and that is embodied in the artilleryman. After the cowardly curate, i.e. the chicken, is eaten by the Martians, the narrator moves on and he encounters an artilleryman who, while he isn't a chicken, he does express that same Darwinian resignation about the victory of the Martians. He says on page 177, "This isn't a war," said the artilleryman. "It never was a war, any more than there's war between man and ants. Cities, nations, civilization, progress, it's all over. The game's up. We're beat." However, he goes on to tell the narrator, "I'm grim set on living, and if I'm not mistaken, you'll show what insides you've got too before long. We aren't going to be exterminated." We don't know everything, though. We've got to learn before we've got a chance, and we've got to live and keep independent while we learn. See, that's what has to be done. In response, the narrator writes, "I stared, astonished, and stirred profoundly by the man's resolution. 'Great God,' cried I, 'but you are a man indeed.'" However, that admiration is fleeting. Just a couple pages later, on page 183, the narrator writes, "For a while, the imaginative daring of the artilleryman and the tone of assurance and courage he assumed completely dominated my mind. I believed unhesitatingly, both in his forecast of human destiny and in the practicability of his astonishing scheme, and the reader who thinks me susceptible and foolish must contrast his position, reading steadily with all his thoughts about his subject, and mine, crouching fearfully in the bushes and listening, distracted by apprehension. We talked in this manner through the early morning time, and later crept out of the bushes, and after scanning the sky for Martians, hurried precipitately to the house on Putney Hill where he had made his lair. It was the coal cellar of the place, and when I saw the work he had spent a week upon, it was a burrow scarcely 10 yards long, which he designed to reach to the main drain on Putney Hill, I had my first inkling of the gulf between his dreams and his powers. Such a hole I could have dug in a day, but I believed in him sufficiently to work with him all that morning until past midday at his digging." "We're working well," he said. He put down his spade. "Let us knock off a bit," he said. "I think it's time we reconnoitered from the roof of the house." I was for going on, and after a little hesitation he resumed his spade, and then suddenly I was struck by a thought. I stopped, and so did he at once. "Why were you walking about the common," I said, "instead of being here working?" "Taking the air," he said. "I was coming back. It's safer by night." "But the work?" "Oh, one can't always work," he said, and in a flash I saw the man plane. Despite the fact that aliens are rampaging, the artilleryman is more than willing to lay down his spade and take a break, and the narrator quickly ascertains that even though this guy talks a big game, he does not have the self-discipline to keep either himself, let alone the pair of them, safe. When I read that, my brain immediately went to 1 Corinthians 9:27 when Paul writes that he disciplines his body, bringing it under strict control so that after preaching to others, he does not disqualify himself. Paul is not interested in talking a big game and then throwing his spade away or taking a break. No, he disciplines his flesh, his body, bringing it under strict control. He has not been neglectful. That makes me actually think of a poem by Maltbie, Davenport, Babcock, which is just such a solid name, and it's called Be Strong. Be strong. We are not here to play, to dream, to drift. We have hard work to do and loads to lift. Fear not the struggle, face it, 'tis God's gift. Be strong. Say not the days are evil, who's to blame, and fold thy arms and acquiesce for shame. Stand up, speak out, and bravely in God's name. Be strong. It matters not how deep entrenched the wrong, how hard the battle fought, the day how long. Faint not, fight on, for tomorrow comes the song. Be strong, be strong, be strong. The alternative to being strong, to disciplining our body and flesh, bringing it under strict control, is being neglectful, is allowing things like cowardice and sloth to set up encampments. And when the war of the world comes in, we're either gonna collapse like the curate or kick back like the artilleryman. And neither of those are gonna be super helpful when it comes to mounting a resistance. So yeah, my second takeaway from the War of the Worlds is don't neglect the war against the flesh. My third and final takeaway from the War of the Worlds was be aware of the horseshoe effect. And if you haven't heard of that, I think a lot of people are more familiar with it in terms of politics, where people on the extreme left and the extreme right actually start to sound a lot alike. It's that horseshoe effect where opposite ends, but they start coming closer together. And there's a poem I love that I think illustrates this point really well. It's called A Reasonable Affliction by Matthew Prior, and it goes like this. On his deathbed, poor Lubin lies. His spouse is in despair. With frequent cries and mutual sighs, they both express their care. A different cause, says Parson Sly, the same effect may give. Poor Lubin fears that he may die, his wife that he may live. Completely different causes, same effect. And when it comes to War of the Worlds, the effect that this helped me think through a little bit more and approach from a different angle was human beings' indifference to other people's misfortune. Prior to reading War of the Worlds, I had read this book, Regarding the Pain of Others by Susan Sontag, wherein she makes the argument that where people feel safe, they will feel indifferent. Last year, I went to visit a friend of mine, the lovely Lefty, in New York City, and while I was visiting, she took me to the top of her office skyscraper, and when I looked over the edge, I remember thinking, oh my gosh, it's like she said, where a person feels safe, there they will feel indifferent. Someone in a skyscraper looking down thinks, those issues could never touch me, and even if I cared, like, I can't really see. However, when I read War of the Worlds, I became familiar with the other side of that horseshoe, which is, and sometimes people can't care about the sufferings of others because they themselves are in dire straits. In War of the Worlds, after the Martians arrive, the narrator gets separated from his wife, and he's out in the country hiding, trying to survive, but we see on page 135, his wife is very much on his mind. He says, my mind was occupied by anxiety for my wife. I figured her at Leatherhead terrified, in danger, mourning me already as a dead man. I paced the rooms and cried aloud when I thought of how I was cut off from her, of all that might happen to her in my absence. However, shortly after he thinks that, and I mean like a couple pages later, one of the incoming Martian pods lands directly over him, collapses the house that he's in, and he is trapped. And he does not think of his wife again for a full 2 weeks. In fact, he doesn't think of anyone for the next 2 weeks. He is focused on surviving and not being noticed by an alien that wants to eat him. And it isn't until page 168, after the Martian has moved away, that the narrator then emerges from the pit that he was in, and he says, "Within that noisome den from which I had emerged, I had thought with a narrow intensity only of our immediate security. I had not realized what had been happening to the world." Elsewhere in War of the Worlds, Wells writes that the immediate pressure of necessity had hardened their hearts. And I'm like, yeah, like if an alien ship has fallen on your head, you are being immediately pressurized. Concern for others is just going to depart. You are going to have a hardened heart. And again, I have to note that is the exact opposite of the indifference born of safety and security that Sontag writes about. This is an indifference to other people born of the fact that you're in the thick of it. So in sum, reading War of the Worlds broadened my paradigm, gave me a completely different explanation for why sometimes people don't care about the goings-on of other people's lives, about the suffering and the pain others are in, because their own roof has just caved in. Frankly, reading The War of the Worlds made me much more sympathetic to people who don't have the bandwidth to bear other people's burdens at a given time, because they're just so frantic with keeping hold of their own lives. And yet, that said, it also made me all the more in awe of Christ, because last year I visited Yale as a prospective student and ended up staying with my former campus pastor. And while I was there, we had a number of great conversations, but one that was really memorable to me had to do with the War of the Worlds, because I brought up the fact that I'd had this realization of, okay, yeah, you can be so secure and that can lead to indifference, but sometimes total insecurity can lead to being indifferent to the suffering of others. And my former campus pastor's husband, who I will call the gentle giant, said, but that wasn't the case with Jesus. When he was on the cross, his life on the line, being crucified, he was not preoccupied with himself. We are told in Luke 23:34 that Jesus, well, again, he's being crucified, says, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." And I was just like, oh my gosh, Jesus has an answer to that War of the Worlds side of the horseshoe, where he's like, yeah, my life is on the line. I'm being crucified. And yet my thought is for you. My care is for you. And then I was thinking of the Sontag side of the horseshoe about, you know, you're in a skyscraper. You're so safe. You're so secure. And yet Jesus, God incarnate, came down from heaven. We are told in Philippians, Christ did not count equality with God as something to be grasped, but he made himself nothing, becoming in the very nature a servant, and being found in appearance as a man. He humbled himself to the point of death, even death on the cross. For Jesus, it didn't matter what side of the horseshoe he was on, total security or total insecurity. His thought was for us. His care was for us. And I'm just like, Lord, what? So in summary, the War of the Worlds made me mindful of the fact that when an alien invasion happens, or anything like that, I need to beware of seams, not neglect the war against the flesh, and also be aware of the horseshoe effect. But above all, the War of the Worlds reminded me that Jesus is the best, the best, the best. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope this was edifying, encouraging, and entertaining, and I hope that you will continue to join me as I visit many good books, but live in the Bible. Speaking of aliens, this is one of my all-time favorite shirts. So yeah, live long and prosper, except not prosperity gospel. None of that nonsense.